Justin's heart raced as the officer reached for his baton. Just as things were about to turn violent, a helicopter roared overhead, landing right on the beach. The door slid open, and out stepped a team of men in black suits, their cold eyes locked on the officer. What happened next? You won't believe. The sun hung high in the cloudless sky, casting a golden glow over the shimmering waves of Laguna Beach. The steady sound of the tide blended with the distant chatter of beachgoers and the laughter of children building sandcastles near the shore. Justin and Kayla Wright sat comfortably beneath a large navy blue beach umbrella, the heat of the afternoon softened by a light ocean breeze. Justin, shirtless, leaned back on a folding chair, his toned chest glistening slightly with sweat. His sunglasses perched lazily on his nose as he sipped from a chilled bottle of water. Kayla, sitting beside him, stretched out her long legs, her skin glowing under the sunlight. Her sleek one-piece swimsuit hugged her figure, and her long, dark curls were pulled into a tight ponytail. She lowered her oversized sunglasses and smiled as Justin adjusted the umbrella to give her more shade. "Babe, this is perfect," Kayla murmured, her voice soft and content. Justin smiled. He reached over, took her hand, and kissed the back of it. The moment was peaceful, almost too perfect. A shadow stretched across the sand. Justin felt it before he saw it, a chill creeping down his spine. Slowly, he lifted his sunglasses and glanced up. A tall, middle-aged white man stood over them, his arms crossed, mirrored aviator sunglasses reflecting the sun's glare. His buzz cut was sharp, his jaw rigid. His white polo shirt clung tightly to his wide chest, the word patrol stitched above his heart in black thread. A thin line of sweat glistened on his temple. His eyes, hidden behind the mirrored lenses, were locked on Justin. "Can I help you?" Justin said evenly, sitting up straighter. "ID," the man snapped. His tone was clipped, practiced, like someone who was used to giving orders and having them followed. Justin's brows furrowed. "Excuse me?" The man's expression remained hard. "I need to see some ID." Justin and Kayla exchanged a confused look. Kayla's brows knit together beneath the rim of her sunglasses. "We're at a public beach," Justin said, his voice steady. "Why would we need to show ID?" The man stepped closer. His polished white sneakers sank slightly into the sand. His stance widened, his shoulders squaring. A subtle tension radiated off him like heat from asphalt. "This beach has had some incidents," the man said, his mouth twisting at the last word. "Just doing my job." Justin's eyes narrowed. "Are you even a cop?" "I'm with the beach patrol," the man said. The condescension in his voice was palpable. "Beach patrol?" Kayla's eyes sharpened beneath her glasses. "So, not a cop?" The man's jaw flexed. "That's enough." Justin's posture stiffened. His muscles coiled beneath his skin like tensioned steel. "We're not doing anything wrong," Justin said firmly. The man's lip curled. "You people always say that." Justin's body went cold. A familiar burn ignited in his chest. His hands curled into fists. "What did you just say?" Justin's voice was low and dangerous. The man's hand lowered toward his belt. A baton and a pair of plastic zip ties were clipped to his side. "Hand over your ID," the man repeated, his voice flat. "Now!" Kayla sat up, her body tight with tension. "Justin, let's just—" Before she could finish, the man's hand shot out and grabbed Justin's arm. Justin's instincts kicked in instantly. His muscles surged with adrenaline. He twisted out of the man's grip and pulled back. "That's assault!" the man barked, his face twisting in righteous anger. Justin's eyes blazed. "No! This is assault!" He shoved the man's hand off him. The man's hand shot toward his baton. The air between them crackled with raw hostility. Justin's chest heaved as the man's fingers curled around the handle. Then the sound hit, deep, mechanical, vibrating through the sand. Whoop, 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 whoop. A helicopter. Justin's gaze snapped upward. Overhead, a sleek black helicopter was descending fast, whipping up sand and salt spray as it neared the ground. The rotors sent gusts of hot air whipping across the beach. Umbrellas tipped over, beach towels lifted from the ground. The man stumbled back, shielding his face with his arm. Kayla's hair whipped loose from her ponytail. Justin squinted through the chaotic blur of sand and wind. The helicopter landed with military precision, the landing skids sinking into the soft sand. The side door slid open with a mechanical hiss. A man in a dark, tailored suit stepped out, his hair slicked back, an earpiece glinting beneath the sunlight. His face was cold and unreadable, sharp cheekbones beneath angular sunglasses. Behind him, 2 men in black tactical suits followed, their broad shoulders and muscular frames cutting imposing silhouettes against the sunlit sky. Justin's eyes widened. The suited man's gaze swept over the scene with clinical precision before locking onto Justin. He stepped forward. His polished black shoes left crisp imprints in the sand. "Mr. Wright," the man said smoothly, his voice cutting through the helicopter's fading roar. "Mrs. Wright, is there a problem here?" Justin's heart hammered in his chest. He could barely process the scene in front of him. The officer, Mitchell, staggered back, eyes wide behind his sunglasses. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. They... Mitchell's gaze darted between Justin and the suited man. Ryan's mouth curled into a thin, sharp smile. "Your name?" Mitchell hesitated. "Officer Mitchell, Beach Patrol." Ryan's eyes darkened beneath his glasses. "Beach Patrol." He repeated the words slowly, his voice edged with disdain. "I'm authorized to..." Mitchell started. "You're not authorized to touch my client," Ryan interrupted. His voice was soft, calm, deadly. Justin's breath quickened. Mitchell's hand drifted toward his baton again. The guards behind Ryan straightened, their bodies taut with readiness. Mitchell's face twisted. His mouth curled. "They don't belong here," Mitchell snarled. Ryan's expression didn't change, but the atmosphere sharpened dangerously. "What did you say?" Mitchell's chest heaved. His hand curled around the baton. Justin's muscles tightened. Mitchell's arm moved, fast. The guards were faster. A blur of motion. One guard twisted Mitchell's arm behind his back. The baton clattered to the sand. Mitchell screamed. "Let me go!" Ryan adjusted his cuff. "You threatened my clients." "They resisted," Mitchell yelled. Ryan stepped closer until his face was inches from Mitchell's. "You put your hands on them." Mitchell's face twisted. "This isn't over." Ryan's lip curled. "Oh, it's over." Justin's heart pounded as Mitchell thrashed helplessly beneath the guard's grip. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the air. Mitchell's eyes widened. His mouth twisted into a desperate snarl. Justin's hand curled tightly around Kayla's. Kayla leaned close, her lips brushing his ear. "Who the hell is Ryan?" Justin's pulse hammered. "I don't know." Ryan's gaze turned toward the approaching police cars. His smile was thin, sharp. Justin exhaled. His chest heaved. And then, everything began to change. The helicopter's blades cut through the salty air, whipping up a violent storm of sand and sea spray. Beach umbrellas toppled, towels lifted into the air, flapping wildly before being dragged along the sand. Kayla's hair whipped free from her ponytail, dark curls lashing against her face as she squinted through the chaotic whirlwind. Justin instinctively stepped in front of her, shielding her from the debris. Officer Mitchell stumbled back, raising an arm to shield his face from the blasting wind. His sunglasses slipped down his nose, and he hastily shoved them back into place. His eyes, now partially visible, were wide and uncertain, the confidence he'd held just moments ago bleeding away as the helicopter descended with military precision. The polished black skids touched the sand with a soft thud, the weight of the machine pressing grooves into the wet surface. The side door slid open with a sharp hiss. A man in a dark, perfectly tailored suit stepped out with smooth, calculated movements. He adjusted the cuff of his jacket as he emerged, not even flinching at the whipping sand or the deafening hum of the blades. His dark hair was slicked back, and a slim earpiece looped around his right ear. His face was angular, cold, and unreadable. A statue carved from marble, untouched by the surrounding chaos. Two men in black tactical suits followed close behind. Their chests were broad, their arms heavy with muscle beneath the dark fabric. Sunglasses obscured their eyes, but their stillness and precision made their purpose clear. They were predators, poised and waiting for a reason to strike. Their posture was unnervingly calm, as if this scene was routine for them. "Mr. Wright, Mrs. Wright, is everything okay?" The suited man's voice cut through the fading roar of the helicopter, calm and controlled. Justin and Kayla's tension softened marginally at the familiar voice. Justin stepped forward, brushing sand off his shorts. "We're fine, Ryan," he said, though the tightness in his voice suggested otherwise. Ryan's eyes flicked toward Officer Mitchell. His gaze sharpened instantly, the subtle softness he'd shown to Justin and Kayla vanishing behind a wall of ice. His eyes narrowed. "Is there a problem?" Mitchell's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His face had lost color, the bravado leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. His lips parted and closed again before he managed to speak. They... Ryan's head tilted slightly. "Your name?" His tone was clipped and frigid, not a request, an order. Mitchell's jaw flexed. "Officer Mitchell, Beach Patrol." Ryan's lip curled. "You're not a real cop." Mitchell's mouth twitched. His face flushed. I'm authorized." Ryan stepped closer. The precision of his movements was surgical. Each step measured, deliberate. The air seemed to tighten between them. The guards flanking Ryan straightened, their hands relaxed at their sides. But the tension in their bodies was coiled and dangerous, like a drawn bowstring ready to snap. "You put your hands on Mr. Wright?" Ryan's tone was low, dangerous. Mitchell's expression darkened. "He was being uncooperative." Ryan's eyes glinted dangerously beneath the harsh sunlight. His mouth formed a hard line. "You mean he refused to let you harass him?" Mitchell's eyes flashed with something dark, something raw and ugly. His lip curled. His hand hovered dangerously close to his baton. "They don't belong here," he snarled. The words slammed into the air like a gunshot. Justin's fists tightened at his sides. His breathing sharpened. Kayla's hand slipped into his, her fingers cool and trembling. A chill spread through Justin's chest. Not from fear, but from the deep, simmering rage that unfurled beneath his ribs. Ryan's eyes narrowed. His mouth curled into a smile, slow and predatory. "Excuse me?" His tone dropped into a dangerous register, sharp as broken glass. Mitchell's face burned red beneath the sun. His hand inched toward the baton clipped to his belt. His breath quickened. His body language shifted from uncertainty to aggression. His knees bent slightly, his shoulders squaring. "They need to leave." Mitchell spat, his eyes cold and venomous. Ryan's gaze sharpened. His head tilted slightly like he was processing a threat. He inhaled slowly. The guards behind him mirrored the movement in perfect synchronicity, their hands drifting toward their sides. Ryan's voice lowered. "Remove him." The guards moved as one. Mitchell's hand shot toward his baton. Two sets of hands were on him in an instant, One guard wrenched Mitchell's arm behind his back with brutal efficiency. Mitchell gasped, his body buckling under the sudden pressure. His baton clattered to the sand. "You can't!" Mitchell's face contorted as his knees were forced into the wet sand. Ryan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Try me." Mitchell thrashed, but the guard's grip was steel. The pressure on his arm increased, his face twisted in pain. His sunglasses slipped off and hit the sand. You can't do this!" Mitchell hissed through gritted teeth. Ryan crouched down, his face inches from Mitchell's ear. His voice was soft, a sharp contrast to the violence unfolding beneath him. "You put your hands on my client." They resisted." Ryan's mouth curled into something cold and dangerous. "Resisted what exactly?" Mitchell's jaw flexed. His breath quickened. His face was red with fury and humiliation. "You have no authority here," Ryan said. "No badge, no jurisdiction." His voice was steady, controlled. "And yet you put your hands on a citizen. Do you know what that's called?" Mitchell's lips twisted. "I was doing my job." "No," Ryan said quietly. His smile was sharp enough to cut steel. "You were abusing power you don't have." Mitchell's chest heaved. Sweat trickled down his temple. The guard's grip didn't ease. Ryan's eyes darkened. His tone sharpened. "And that makes you a liability." Mitchell's mouth opened to argue, but Ryan's gaze cut through him like a blade. Mitchell's breath hitched. His knees sank deeper into the sand. Justin watched the scene unfold in stunned silence. His heart was hammering. His chest heaved. The sheer precision with which Ryan and his team had neutralized the threat left him breathless. Kayla's hand tightened in his. Ryan straightened, buttoning his jacket with a smooth motion. "Take him away." The guards began to haul Mitchell to his feet. Mitchell thrashed. "You don't know who you're messing with." Ryan's gaze was ice. "I don't care." Mitchell's face twisted with rage as the guards dragged him toward the helicopter. His shouts were swallowed by the rising hum of the rotors. Ryan adjusted his cuffs. His eyes flicked toward Justin and Kayla. His expression softened, just slightly. "Mr. Wright, Mrs. Wright, I apologize for the inconvenience." Justin's breath steadied. Kayla's shoulders dropped. Justin met Ryan's gaze. "Thank you," Justin said, his voice low. Ryan's mouth curled into a faint smile. "It's my job." Mitchell's shouts faded as the helicopter blades began to spin again. Sand lifted into the air as the helicopter lifted off the ground. Justin watched as Mitchell's figure shrank beneath the shadow of the rising aircraft. Ryan's gaze lingered on them for a moment longer. "Shall we continue the afternoon?" Ryan said smoothly. Justin's lips curled into a small smile. "Yeah, I think we shall." Mitchell's hand moved fast, too fast. His fingers curled around the handle of his baton with a sharp, mechanical snap. The sound cut through the heavy tension in the air like a gunshot. His knuckles whitened as he yanked it free from his belt in one swift motion. The polished black metal flashed in the harsh sunlight. Justin's breath hitched. His muscles coiled with instinctive tension. "Careful!" Justin shouted, his voice sharp. Mitchell's arm twisted. His eyes were wild, a dangerous gleam in them that hadn't been there before. His mouth curled into something dark and ugly. He swung, a blur of motion. Before the baton could connect, one of the guards exploded into action. His body moved with lethal precision, a fluid extension of raw muscle and training. His hand snapped out, caught Mitchell's wrist, and twisted. Mitchell's mouth wrenched open in a silent gasp of pain as the baton was ripped from his grip. It hit the sand with a dull thud. "Ah! Let me go!" Mitchell screamed, his voice cracking with panic and rage. The guard's grip didn't loosen. His hand closed like a vice around Mitchell's wrist, twisting his arm behind his back with practiced efficiency. Mitchell's knees buckled beneath the force. His face twisted into a grimace of pain as his shoulder was pushed into an unnatural angle. His free hand clawed at the guard's forearm, but it was like trying to bend steel. Ryan's voice cut through the chaos, low and cold. "You threatened my clients," Mitchell thrashed. His feet dug into the sand. "You can't do this," he shrieked, his voice climbing into a desperate pitch. "I have rights." Ryan stepped forward, his expression carved from stone. His dark eyes narrowed, his mouth curved into a thin, cutting smile. "Do you?" The guard's grip tightened. Mitchell's knees hit the sand with a sharp impact. He hissed in pain. His breath hitched. Sand stuck to the sweat on his face. His body trembled beneath the guard's hold, a thin sheen of panic leaking through his mask of indignation. Justin stepped forward, his chest rising and falling with the weight of his breathing. His heart hammered so hard it thudded in his ears. He stared down at Mitchell, rage tightening his throat. "You put your hands on me," Justin said, his voice low and sharp. His fists curled at his sides. His pulse throbbed beneath his skin. His jaw flexed. "On my wife." Mitchell's face burned red. A vein pulsed in his temple. His eyes darted between Justin and Ryan, searching for some crack, some weakness, but there was none. "This isn't over," Mitchell spat. His voice shook with forced conviction. Ryan's gaze sharpened. His mouth twitched at the corners, but there was no warmth in his expression. Only ice. Ryan crouched down, his knees sinking slightly into the sand. His face hovered inches from Mitchell's ear. His voice dropped into a dangerously soft register, low enough that only Mitchell could hear. "Oh, it's over." Mitchell's breath quickened. His chest heaved. His eyes widened beneath the crushing weight of Ryan's proximity. Mitchell's mouth opened, but no words came out. And then, distantly, the rising wail of police sirens. Mitchell's eyes widened further. A thin line of sweat trickled down his temple. His head whipped toward the street, toward the flashing blue and red lights approaching from the distance. His breathing sharpened into ragged gasps. Justin's lip curled into something hard. Kayla slipped her hand into his, her fingers threading through his. He squeezed her hand. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were sharp and clear. Mitchell's body twisted beneath the guard's grip. "You're going to regret this," he hissed, his voice thin and brittle. His jaw flexed, his teeth bared like a wounded animal. Ryan's eyes darkened, his mouth twitched at the corners. Not a smile, a warning. "We'll see," Ryan said. The guard tightened his grip. Mitchell grunted as his body was hauled upright. His legs wobbled beneath him, but the guards held him firm. His breath hitched. His eyes darted around the beach, but there was no escape, no path out. Justin stepped closer, his gaze steady. His heart was still pounding, but now it was laced with clarity, a burning steadiness. His mouth curled into a hard line. Mitchell's lips parted. His eyes sharpened beneath the sheen of sweat and humiliation. "This isn't—" "Shut up," Ryan said flatly. Mitchell's mouth clamped shut. The police sirens grew louder, closer. The sound was cutting through the humid air, sharp and rhythmic. A pair of squad cars pulled onto the boardwalk, tires grinding against the pavement. The flashing lights bathed the sand in pulses of blue and red. The officers stepped out, real officers. 2 men and a woman, dressed in dark navy uniforms with badges clipped to their chests. Their hands rested near their holsters, eyes narrowing toward the scene unfolding before them. Ryan's gaze didn't waver. His hand slid into his jacket pocket and pulled out a slim black wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a dark security badge embossed with gold lettering. The lead officer's eyes widened. "Mr. Lockwood?" the officer said, his voice stiff with recognition. Ryan nodded. "This man," he gestured toward Mitchell with a flick of his wrist, "put his hands on my clients. He refused to identify himself properly and escalated the situation without cause. Mitchell thrashed weakly in the guard's grip. "They were being aggressive. I was defending myself." "Defending yourself?" Ryan's brow lifted, his voice sharpened. "From what? Sitting down?" The lead officer's gaze shifted toward Justin and Kayla. His eyes flicked over the sand-scuffed marks near their chairs, the overturned umbrella, the discarded baton. His jaw flexed. "Do you have proof?" the officer asked. Justin's mouth curved slightly. "We do." He pulled his phone from his pocket and tapped the screen. A video file popped open. The officer leaned in as Justin pressed play. The audio was sharp. Mitchell's voice came through loud and clear. "You people always say that." The officer's jaw tightened. Mitchell's face twisted. "Put him in the car," the officer said to his partner. Mitchell thrashed. "No, you can't." "You're under arrest for assault and misconduct," the officer said coolly. He reached for his handcuffs. The guard released Mitchell, allowing the officer to grab his arm and wrench it behind his back. The handcuffs snapped shut. Mitchell screamed in rage. "You can't do this." The officer smiled thinly. "We just did." Mitchell's gaze shot toward Ryan. His eyes were wide and wild. "You'll pay for this," he spat. Ryan adjusted his cuff. "That sounds like a threat." The officer shoved Mitchell toward the squad car. He stumbled, his face burning with humiliation. Justin stood still, his breath evening out. His pulse slowed beneath his skin. Kayla's hand slipped back into his. Ryan stepped toward them, his gaze softened slightly. "Mr. Wright, Mrs. Wright." He smiled faintly. "Shall we continue the afternoon?" Justin's lips curved. He inhaled slowly. His muscles unwound. "Yeah," Justin said. "I think we shall." The police car's door slammed shut. Mitchell's shouts were swallowed by the thick glass as the vehicle pulled away from the beach. Justin's gaze followed it until it disappeared. Kayla leaned into his side. Justin exhaled, slow and steady. Ryan's gaze followed the police car. His expression softened, but his eyes remained sharp. The afternoon sun gleamed off the sand. The ocean breeze stirred the air. Calm settled over the beach once more. But beneath the surface, the tension still simmered, quiet, sharp, and unforgettable. The sharp wail of police sirens cut through the air, growing louder as two black and white squad cars pulled onto the boardwalk. The tires ground against the concrete, the flashing red and blue lights casting pulsing reflections across the sand and the ocean waves beyond. Beachgoers, who had been watching the drama unfold with wide-eyed curiosity, began to whisper and scatter, giving the scene a wide berth. The tension in the air was palpable, sharp and electric, the weight of what had just happened still hanging heavily over the beach. The first officer stepped out, a tall, broad-shouldered man with dark sunglasses perched on his nose and a cleanly pressed navy uniform. His partner, a younger man with sharp, alert eyes, followed close behind, his hand resting near his holster as his gaze swept over the scene. Their postures were tense, their faces tight with confusion as they took in the sight before them. Mitchell on his knees in the sand, his face flushed and twisted in pain, held firmly in the grip of two towering security guards. Ryan stood nearby, perfectly composed, his hands folded in front of him. His suit was still immaculate despite the chaos of the last few minutes. Justin and Kayla stood a few steps behind him, their expressions tense but steady. Justin's chest still heaved slightly from the adrenaline coursing through his veins, and Kayla's hand rested on his arm, grounding him. The lead officer's brow furrowed beneath his sunglasses. "What's going on here?" His tone was cautious but edged with authority. His gaze shifted between the guards, Mitchell and Ryan. Ryan's expression didn't change. His eyes remained cold and calculating. He took a single step forward and gestured toward Mitchell with a casual flick of his wrist. "This man assaulted my clients," Ryan said, his tone flat and sharp as glass. "He needs to be charged." Mitchell's face crumbled. His mouth opened and closed uselessly, his throat bobbing as he struggled to form a coherent defense. His eyes darted toward the officers, desperation leaking into his gaze. "Wait. No. They were... Do you have body cam footage?" Ryan's voice cut through Mitchell's sputtering like a blade. Justin smiled grimly. His eyes darkened with quiet satisfaction. "We do." He pulled his phone from the pocket of his swim trunks. His hands were steady now. The adrenaline that had surged through his veins earlier had settled into cold focus. He tapped the screen and pulled up the recording. The glow of the screen reflected off the officer's sunglasses as Justin held it up. The video played back in crisp detail. Mitchell standing over them, barking orders, his hand grabbing Justin's arm, Justin wrenching away. And then the damning line, "You people always say that." A loaded silence settled over the scene. Even the distant noise of the ocean seemed to fade beneath the weight of Mitchell's words echoing from the phone. The younger officer's face went white beneath the brim of his cap. His mouth tightened into a hard line. The lead officer exhaled through his nose, a vein in his temple twitching. He shifted his gaze toward Mitchell, his jaw flexing. "Put your hands behind your back," the officer said flatly. Mitchell's mouth opened in horror. His eyes widened with raw disbelief. You can't... You're under arrest for assault and misconduct," the officer said, his tone devoid of emotion. He reached for his handcuffs. Mitchell thrashed, his body tensed as the guard holding him forced his arms behind his back. "No!" he screamed, his voice rising into a thin, panicked pitch. "They provoked me. I was just..." Click. The metallic sound of the handcuffs snapping shut was loud in the tense silence. Mitchell's breath quickened into shallow, panicked gasps. His face twisted as the reality of the situation sank in. His eyes shot toward Ryan, burning with naked hatred. "You can't do this!" Ryan's mouth curved into a cold smile. "We already did." The guards hauled Mitchell to his feet with rough efficiency. He stumbled, his knees digging into the sand as the officers took control. Mitchell's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His face burned red with humiliation, his breath coming in ragged bursts. His chest heaved. The lead officer pulled Mitchell toward the squad car. Mitchell's feet dragged uselessly against the sand. His shoulders twisted beneath the grip of the officer's hand. His face contorted. "This is harassment!" he shouted. "I was doing my job!" The officer didn't respond. He opened the squad car door and shoved Mitchell inside with a swift, practiced motion. Mitchell's head knocked lightly against the roof as he collapsed into the back seat. His face twisted toward the window, his mouth still moving. But his voice was muffled beneath the thick glass as the officer slammed the door shut. Justin exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest finally starting to uncoil. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of the adrenaline leaving his body. Kayla's hand slid down his arm and laced through his fingers. He squeezed her hand tightly. Ryan adjusted his tie with a smooth, practiced motion. His gaze remained steady on the squad car as the officer circled around toward the driver's side. His expression was composed, calm in a way that felt unnatural after the storm that had just unfolded. "Mr. Wright, Mrs. Wright." Ryan's voice was low and even. "I think your afternoon can resume without further interruption." Justin's lips curled into a dry smile. His chest still felt tight, but the weight was less oppressive now. "Guess so." Kayla leaned into Justin's side. Her head rested lightly against his shoulder. "Thanks, Ryan," she said softly. Ryan's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "All part of the job." Justin's gaze drifted toward the helicopter still parked a short distance away. Its blades were still spinning, the low hum vibrating beneath his feet. The guards who had been holding Mitchell now stood on either side of the open helicopter door, their expressions still stoic and unreadable behind their dark sunglasses. Ryan gave a small nod toward them, and as if on cue, the guards stepped back. The helicopter's engine roared to life, the blades cutting faster through the air. Sand lifted from the ground as the powerful gust from the rotors sent small clouds drifting across the beach. Justin and Kayla stepped back as the helicopter lifted from the sand with effortless precision. The sleek black machine ascended rapidly, slicing through the bright afternoon sky before banking toward the horizon. Within seconds, it had disappeared over the water. Justin turned toward Kayla. Her eyes were still wide, her breath shallow. He squeezed her hand. "You okay?" She let out a soft laugh, breathless and shaky but real. "Yeah." Justin's mouth lifted into a small smile. Now that was satisfying. Kayla smiled against his shoulder. "Yeah, it really was." Justin sank back into the beach chair, pulling Kayla down beside him. His arm slid around her shoulders. Kayla leaned into him, resting her head against his chest. The sound of the waves returned, steady, rhythmic, calming. Beachgoers began to relax. The tension that had held the beach captive started to dissolve into the warm, salt air. Ryan remained on the boardwalk for a moment longer, his gaze lingering toward the place where the helicopter had disappeared. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, his steps quiet and deliberate against the wooden planks. Justin watched him go. His chest rose and fell with a steady rhythm. He pressed his lips to the top of Kayla's head and closed his eyes. Peace, real peace, settled over them at last.